All right, y'all. So I wanted to make a video this time rather than to write out questions and expectations for this final, because as I was grading the midterm, I kind of became aware of something that was a bit disturbing. A lot of you guys, it became apparent. Uh, I don't know if you were entering the questions into Chat GPT, but certainly there's some AI intervention. Chat GPT, maybe some other site that you guys, use. But so many of you guys' papers or responses to the midterm questions were very similar, right? Using, a lot of the same language. Some of you all kind of, mixed up the language a little bit, but it's still evident, right? A lot of you guys' arguments and analyses in response to the same questions on the midterm were the same. For example, the question about the Dikenga, so many of you all's analysis. At first, it was like, oh, I was reading it. I'm like, okay, this is good, right? And then I'm seeing so many of you all kind of come with the same analysis and even, kind of articulate it in the same way. Right? The Dikenga has to do with the cycle of oppression and resistance, or oppression and resilience, right? And you know, um, and so so many of y'all came with that analysis and that argument, and which was a good argument, right? But everybody come in the same way with the same exact when there are other analyses, there are other ways, other understandings of how the Dikenga shows up in African American history. And so I'm certainly not teaching this so that I can kind of get regurgitated responses from some type of AI machine. I'm teaching this to, to hear from you all. Okay. And so I decided to go a little light in terms of my grading as it went on. And I understood, I said, I thought about maybe going back and changing some grades or what have you. I said, you know what? I'm just going to make an announcement for the final that, I'm not accepting that for the final, right? If I detect that there are similarities and commonalities amongst, papers and across papers that, then I'm going to red flag it and we're going to investigate it. And while I don't want to deal with that, right, I'm sure y'all don't want to deal with that, I'm definitely prepared to do that, because, we got to set some type of standard. All right. So I'm expecting this to be work that comes from your brain, from your mind. And so I'm also expecting, what I found for a lot of guys' responses to the midterm is that they weren't really substantive when it comes to you referencing course materials, right? Particular resources and or topics or narratives that had to do with certain topics in African American history. You were, some of you all, even, and I'm assuming because you went to Chat GPT, right? The sources or the justification for your arguments came from topics that we hadn't even discussed yet in the class, right? So I say all that to say, for these, right, my expectation is that your work, your justifications, your arguments, your points come from this class, come from what we have covered in this class, either in lectures or in course materials. And I want you to reference what course materials, right? How are you supporting your argument, right? And There Is a River, it speaks on this particular topic, right? And so some of you all did that for the midterm, and those of you all did that performed better in terms of grades as I went on, especially, right? But I want to make it clear for this time, right, that use course materials to support your arguments. I need to know that you have been plugged into this class, right, and that your responses are coming from your experience and what you've learned in this class. All right. With that being said, there are 3 questions I'm going to give you all. It's the same as the midterm, 300-word minimum. Some of you all fell short of that for the midterm. 300-word minimum. The first question has to do with resistance, right? We know that this course has been centered on resistance. And a lot of you all talked about in your midterm, right, how we can look at, through the lens of the Dikanga. It allows us to look at resistance over time, cycles of resistance, right, in African American history. Well, I want you all to do that. I want you all to look at, back over this course from the inception of African American history, right, that we began talking about, particularly, resistance to capture in Africa, right, and from the resistance that we talked about from then to now. And I want you all to answer me this question, right? How has Black resistance, or the resistance of African American people, changed over time? When we look at the resistance from those early days, all right, and all of the cycles, transformations, the different currents of resistance that have shown themselves, have converged, and then diverged again, and come back in different forms, and right, all of the ways that resistance has kind of marched forward, in this cyclical and transforming and transformative way, right? I want, one question is, how has resistance changed over time? How has it changed over time? In what manner, in what fashion? I want you to answer me the question, what contributes to the changes, right? To the ways that resistance has changed over time. Why has it changed in the way that it has, right? I want you to answer the question, when you look overall at the lineage of resistance that makes up African American history, has it been effective? Has the resistance been effective, in accomplishing its goals, in advancing, right, the goals of Black people? And lastly, that's it, all right, for question one. That's it, all right. Now, question two. Remember, there are three questions. You can answer two of them. Question two has to do with, I'm blocking on it now. What was it? Question one was resistance. Slavery by another name, right? We discussed it, I believe it was in week 3, about this idea of slavery by another name, right? That really emerged during the Jim Crow era, post-Reconstruction, right? The idea essentially being that white Southerners created a system to maintain or to reestablish slavery as existed in the South for hundreds of years, right? In another form and by another name, right? They couldn't maintain it in the same way, right? So they developed a way to maintain the power relationships, a way to maintain the social order, right? From slavery, right? In times where slavery was technically over, right? And so, slavery by another name. Michelle Alexander argues in the new Jim Crow, right, that many of the same obstacles and challenges, much of the same power relationship, right, that existed, that was established during the Jim Crow era, exists today, right, in a different form, right? So some folks argue that that because of this, that black people still today are enslaved, right? That slavery still exists in America today by another name. Do you agree with this? Right? Like these people argue that while we don't work on plantations, we're not forced to work on plantations, we don't exist in bondage. And so the same level of physical restriction for many of us doesn't exist. Others argue that millions of us are in prison today. And so literally that level of physical restriction does exist. But that even for those of us that don't, that the fundamental power relationships and that our achievement of the independence that we've been seeking from the time that we got out of the Civil War, right, has not been effective, right? Other folks on the opposite side say, yes, but look at all of the advancement that our communities have made. Look at the things that we're able to do. Look at what we've been able to accumulate, the positions that we've been able to occupy and what have you. Where do you